There we go. Hi, everyone. Welcome back. You've made it all the way back to where we started a couple days ago. It seems like eons ago. I see we've lost a few over the past couple days, but thank you to all of you who have made it through all the way to the end. I am sure you were exhausted. I am exhausted, but hopefully also in a really good way. I'm going to start us off with just a few minor housekeeping items. One is the evaluation that we're hoping all of you will be willing to fill out after you leave. You'll be receiving it over email. You can also go directly onto SwapCard and push the reflections button. It'll take you less than 10 minutes, and I beg you, please take the time, maybe when you're in the airport tonight, because it will be super helpful for us. And we're not just looking for your feedback. We also want to know what you learned, what you got out of it, and when you want to do it again. And then the second housekeeping item is these lanyards. So you might have noticed they're a little bit gritty. They actually have seeds in them, so if you want to go plant them out in the dirt, wildflowers will grow. Or if you don't have a garden, you can actually recycle these on your way out the door. There are bins, and they will go to a local nonprofit that does urban gardening. So you've got great options there. So let's see. This morning, I was trying to think to myself, what should I get up here and say today? How could I close up what was an incredible 3 days? And I think my first instinct was that I should try to summarize or synthesize what has happened. So I started thinking about all of the conversations that I have had over the past 3 days, the sessions that I've joined. And then I started thinking about what it means to multiply that by the 650 people that were here, and I realized that the notion of synthesis was probably somewhat of an impossible task. So I'm going to start with talking about my experience, the feelings I've had, the reflections I've had, and then I'm also going to ask a few other people to join me on stage so that we can bring some additional perspectives, and maybe with these additional perspectives we can start inching closer to what is a synthesis and a path forward. But first I'm going to share one feeling and one reflection I've had over the past 3 days. I think the biggest feeling I have right now is one of intense gratitude. It is just such an honor to be a part of this community, to have been a part of its growth and its accomplishments over the past decade, and to be in a position where I can help bring this community together on a periodic basis to have the kind of conversations that we've had. I feel very, very lucky. The conversations that I've been a part of have been inspiring. They've been very honest, sometimes brutally honest. And what's, I think, most important to me is that they've been very grounded. It's a very practical conversation about what we need to do and how we can start doing it better together. So I'm grateful for all of you. Thank you for being here, and thank you for being part of those conversations. And then the reflection I have has to do with the 3 history lessons that I opened this conference with. Raise your hand if you remember all 3 history lessons. Maybe a passage. I don't see a lot of hands, actually. Okay, so I'll have to do better next time to really reinforce those messages up front, but I will repeat them now. So the first lesson was about when it comes to maps, our motives matter. And it's been clear to me over the past 3 days that we share common motivations, our high-level objectives, the 8 action tracks of the summit, but at the same time, we all have quite distinct motives. We are working at very different scales, in very different places, with different stakeholders, in different sectors. And we are just 650 people here. There are many other people with different motivations for maps that aren't in this room today that probably should be in this room. And there really is no one single data set or map that is going to serve all of our motives. Which then brings me back to the second lesson, which was the importance of technology and technology access. And I said on day 1 that one of the beauties of modern day technology is that it's democratizing access to geospatial information. But I think given our diverse motives, we actually need to go a step further. It's not just about access to that information. It's about democratizing access to the tools that will help anyone create the information that they need to serve their motives. And then the final lesson was about the primacy of partnerships. And even before I got here on Tuesday, I already count many of you as partners. Some of you are new partners, some of you have been working with for a decade now. But what really struck me over the conversations I've had is that we need to be deepening our partnerships. And that can be hard because I know I'm leaving this conversation with a lot of excitement. I want to go home, I want to follow up, but I'm also going to open up my laptop and I'm going to see all the emails I haven't read over the past 3 days. I'm going to get sucked in, and that follow-up starts to drop down the totem pole of importance. But I think if there is one investment we can make, one investment of time, I think that investment into partnerships is going to pay huge returns for us if we can deepen them. And then also, to be able to deepen them, I think we need to give them more focus. There is so much urgency around the issues we are working on, and there is so little time. We need to figure out what are the few big things we can do together over the next few years. What are the step change improvements in geospatial data and solutions that we can bring to a community that's really going to unlock the progress that we want to see? I don't have answers for all of those challenges right now, but I'm going to invite some people on stage that I'm hoping can add some additional insight and color to this conversation. We have 5 terrific panelists. Before you all step up, I just want to say that each of these panelists is going to bring a different angle and a different vantage point. And the process here is I'm going to introduce each one in turn and ask them to share a short preliminary intervention, basically which are the action tracks that you participated in, what was a key insight or a key call to action that came out of that action track for you. And then I will facilitate a discussion. And I met with all the panelists this morning. I asked them to be candid, to be honest, and to be informal. So I will help move the conversation along, but I'm really encouraging the conversation to be interactive and for the panelists to ask each other questions and to interject. I really want everyone to feel a part of this conversation. And then we also will have the Slido option up on the screen, so you guys can input your questions as well, and I'll make sure I leave some time at the end to bring those audience questions into the conversation. So panelists, please come to the stage.
I'm here, I think.
Who's going where?
Yep.
Wow.
No?
Doesn't matter.
Christian is
Fine.
here.
Huh? I got it.
Oh, yeah, Andrew, I think you're right here. Sorry, we have assigned seating. Oh, I don't think it matters too much. I just said we were trying to be informal, so. All right, I'm going to get us started. I'm going to start by introducing Andrew Wilcox. Andrew is the head of digital programs for Unilever's business operations and sustainability, where he leads the deployment of data and technology in Unilever's sustainable sourcing and impact programs. So Andrew, please tell us, which sessions did you partake in? What was a key insight or a call to action?
Yeah, thank you. And thanks everyone for being here. Obviously WRI, Bezos Earth Fund, and NICFI for bringing this community together. This community is amazing. The energy, passion, commitment, I don't need to drone on about that. Working with a consumer goods company, I obviously paid a lot of attention to the supply chain track and the technology track. But something that I heard from everyone was that ultimately these data need to be driving some sort of meaningful action. And then another theme that builds on that is that meaningful action often needs to be collective or decentralized. And I think I've been thinking a lot about what I heard from the community and really what do we need as a call to action to mobilize this community to really catalyze that decentralized or collective action at scale. And I think of 2 things. One is we continue this journey or the revolution that Rebecca Moore was speaking about. I think we've spent the last 10 years going from really transformative cutting-edge innovation into basically building and cultivating this data ecosystem. I think our next challenge is going to be to take that data ecosystem and start to build it into an information economy for forests and sustainability. And by that I mean we seek to recreate the instruments of reliability that you see in a really well-functioning economy around product specifications and quality, technical standards, a lot of boring stuff. I heard the word boring used a lot, actually, around this. So there's that. The other thing is I think our community has been a true standard bearer for the idea of radical transparency and the idea of disrupting the status quo. And I think we need to take that willingness to disrupt and that energy and start to apply it towards this idea of radical inclusivity. I see so many websites with a carousel of logos of big multinational firms, and I just think to myself, couldn't that carousel have 100,000 crests of local communities on it, or something to that effect? I think about how we can shift our mental model from capacity building to building products that really meet people where their capacities are. And I think the reason this is so important is if we make this inclusive information economy for forests, we not only accelerate progress on managing and minimizing the harm, but also really realizing that vision around making business and economies a force for good. So.
Thank you so much, Andrew. I really liked this framing around shifting from radical transparency to radical inclusivity. I think it's maybe a better way to say what I was trying to say earlier about moving beyond just access to information to access to the tools that allow everyone to create, use, harness information for good. I'm going to introduce next Luis Mabulo. Luis is the founder of the Cacao Project, which works to cultivate resilient and climate-smart livelihoods through agroforestry in the Philippines. But she's also a chef and a farmer and a National Geographic Young Explorer. So Luis, please tell us your perspectives on the summit.
Thanks so much, Crystal. And I think that the summit so far has been fantastic. There's incredible intersections and dialogues that I've heard. And one thing is, I'm a person who's pretty new to this audience. So it's pretty interesting to me. I followed a lot on the food and land use track, especially with the Food and Land Use Coalition sessions, which are fantastic from a chef's perspective, but also from a farmer's perspective and someone who doesn't have a data science background. And some insights that I've heard, I actually have 3 insights, but one of them is really something that I like to call science telling or storytelling within science, how we communicate these data, these maps, on the ground to the farmers that need them, rural smallholders, to the communities that they talk about, but also to policymakers and how that can be really best operationalized and used. I think something that's really important is the language we use to communicate all this data in different countries, in different contexts, because it could be the same data set, but you can have different insights from it. Now, the second point is going beyond data. So how do we tell the stories all of these data sets and numbers and statistics, that they're people that stand in front of the numbers, in front of the news, that they're not just kind of a line on a graph, but they're individuals, they're landscapes, they're plants and trees and animal life, and being able to communicate that well, especially in the system of agriculture and food, where that impacts people's nutrition, people's health, as well as our environment, the state of our air, and all these different kind of niche parts that play a role in our food systems. And lastly, on a third point, is really mapping potential. Now, the potential for reforestation, the potential for land tenure and ownership, but also the incentives and the economic value that all of these different maps and data sets can have on the ground for people, for governments, whether it's crafting really thoughtful, meaningful policy. But we also we have a lot of conversation in deforestation and losses. But what about gains? What about the potential to transform or even redefine what development might mean in different parts of the world? So those are some really interesting conversations I've had in hallways and within panel sessions, and really it was incredible to hear from everyone.
Thank you, Louise. And I'm going to keep moving down the line, but I do want to return back to this idea of science telling, and if you can help us understand what that looks like as a bunch of people who just spent the last 3 days giving presentations about maps. I'm guessing that's not quite it. So I'd love to dig into that. But let me turn now to Samuel Ngifo. Samuel is the Secretary General for the Center for Environment and Development in Cameroon, where he has spent his career dedicated to protecting the rights of local indigenous communities in the forests in Central Africa. He's also a Goldman Prize winner. So Samuel, please share your calls to action from the summit.
Thank you so much. I was a bit lost as a lawyer in the middle of all these hard scientists. And at the very beginning of the sessions, I did not know I will be able to capture anything from what will be discussed here. But at the end of the day, I'm so grateful that I was here. I learned a lot. I saw so many tools, great diversity of data, of experiences that were shared from almost all the regions of the world, but all very relevant to the area where I come from. So I learned a lot. And two things that I can say on this. First is that I understand that there is a lot of data being generated. And this is very useful. It's really a game changer. But it's not enough. It's necessary, but it's not enough. We need to do a bit more to make sure that people on the ground, especially decision makers, and I include communities within the decision makers, they are part of those who are involved in deforestation. They take a decision. Private sector, local government, national government, they all need to know what this data means. And I think there is an extra effort that will be required, not necessarily from WRI, but probably many more people in this room and outside have the capacities for translating this data into something that can be quickly processed by all decision makers on the field. And I see this as being an emergency, with the same level of emergency than we had at the creation of Global Forest Watch when there was no data. Creating data was an emergency. Today, translating data is an emergency. There is a need to make sure that data can be used at the local level to predict what is likely to happen. Beyond the forestry sector, beyond all the sectors on which we are working, there were a lot of experiences on mining. I think we need to go beyond that. Agriculture, state budget, we need to know. We need to be able to predict. And I think another effort will be to try to reach out to many more organizations, many more sectors than those we have around the table today. Sectors that can help provide answers, provide solutions, alternative to the problems that the data are demonstrating today. We are not able to provide appropriate solutions to agriculture, for example. But there are people out there whose job is exactly to look into that. And I think we need to have them around the table. Having said this, one very last point. I think we should have a better focus on conflict. So what the data are showing is that there are a lot of conflict, youth conflict, but also the possibility of having armed conflict around natural resources. This is an increasing trend, and we have to be able to use the data to predict conflict, to prevent conflict. I think we have all what we need for that, but we need a translation to make it very clear to the decision makers on the field. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Samuel. Starting to see some trends here. Again, this point of decision makers don't just need data, they need to understand what data means, and there's an active translation and synthesis and analysis that is maybe missing for the end user. Let's move on now to Christian Samper. Christian is the Managing Director and Leader for Natural Solutions at the Bezos Earth Fund. Many of us also know him from his time previously as the President and CEO of Wildlife Conservation Society. Christian, let's hear your thoughts.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here. Let me start by saying one amazing thought. I've actually been working in the issue of biodiversity and conservation for 30 years, back to when I helped set up the Humboldt Institute in Colombia, which was designed as a biodiversity, a boundary institution to take the biodiversity data for decision makers. And we were involved with setting up GBIF and some of the others. What's amazing to me is how far we have come, not only in terms of the tools that we have, but the data that we have. We've never had this level of information. It's extraordinary to see this gathering and this interest, and that's something remarkable. Having said that, one of the key things is remember that we're trying to serve many different kinds of users. And I'll tell you an anecdote from the meeting, one of the sessions I attended, which was around 30 by 30. As you know, one of the key goals was the adoption last December in the Kunming-Montreal Protocol on Biodiversity, Global Biodiversity Framework, around protecting 30% of the planet. And we adopted Target 3, or many people quoted the Target 3 there, which is 80 words. And what was fascinating is we had 5 presentations. Every one of the presenters used the same 80 words, but everyone highlighted different words within it. Some people were focused on data, some people were focused on the indigenous rights, whatever, which shows you the same target by the same community has 5 different interpretations. And I think we have to keep that in mind to the plurality of users here. Now, let me mention 3 things that I heard and that I think are challenges for us that we need to look at related to the scale, speed, and collaboration. Well, the issue of scale is a lot of what we've seen. I mean, I went to the biodiversity data right now. It's amazing to see the maps that we're doing, the tools, how much we have globally. And yet, when you try and take that to the ground level to make decisions, most of these tools don't scale. And for a lot of them, you don't have the data there. And just to give you a specific example, so a month ago, I was in northern Namibia looking at the community conservancies that are being managed by these people there, which is extraordinary. And they're generating and managing all this data. All these tools, all these maps, everything we saw here, I never saw them there in Namibia. And all the data that these people are gathering, these community conservancies, is not being input and linked to things like GBIF or whatever it is. So how do we link at the scale? Because in the end, we need a global data layer, we need the country layer, but we need the local issue and the community issue. So I think there's a real disconnect there. I think there's a real power. Second is around speed. Look, the world has changed. We're losing huge areas. You saw the results from Global Forest Watch. This is like now. We can't afford to wait 5 years to take some decisions. So how do we do it faster, and how do we use these tools to really accelerate this? We can't study it forever. We can't wait for all the data. You have to make decisions now. And I'll mention an example. I just came here directly from Brazil. We had a fantastic set of meetings with the government of Brazil, with President Lula and the ministries, and you've seen the incredible change that's happened there politically. And we had a meeting on Monday with the Ministry of Indigenous Peoples, the first time that a ministry has been created around this. And there are 57 million hectares of undesignated lands in the Amazon. And Minister Sonia Guajajara, Tassa and I were just talking about it, they've identified 370 community areas, indigenous areas, that would like to be designated. And President Lula is ready to do them. At the current pace, they're doing about 10 a year. How do we go from 10 to 370 and get it done in 2 years? And that's around data, it's around a whole set of issues. And we as a community need to work with the others, because if we don't do it, we're going to miss a real opportunity. I think Tasso may address some of these things later, but it's a real challenge. This is the issue. Now, we at the Business Earth Fund are willing to help pay for it, but we have business as usual is not going to do it. And if we do it at the pace that we're doing it, we're going to lose a lot of the areas. And the third one's around collaboration. I mean, one of the great things is to see how many institutions are there. And yes, all the carousels with all the logos is great. And we're seeing more collaboration between different kinds of institutions. And yet we still see there's a lot more here. I mean, look, we at the Business Earth Fund right now, I probably got 25 concepts and proposals from people in the audience right now on biodiversity. How do these pieces fit together around a single answer? And very importantly, who was not here? Which are the collaborations beyond it, whether it's private sector or some others? But there was a wonderful example that happened yesterday in the restoration session with unusual fellows. We have been working with WRI in doing some restoration projects in East Africa around restoration, community-based, working with One Acre Fund and other organizations around this. So we said, we're doing this community work. And yet what we had there, we had Meta in the room, and they said, we want to buy carbon credits. That's great, but the challenge is they're going to pay for results. And they said, but you need some financing for the local people. But Robobank was there and said, well, we can provide the financing, and then we're scaling this up. Those kinds of connections and collaboration between unusual fellows that extend beyond this community is what I think we need to have bigger impact. So I'll leave it there, and we can come back to some of those points later.
Thanks, Christian. A lot to dig into there. But again, hearing some similar words, Samuel mentioned emergency, you mentioned urgency. I definitely getting that message. Okay, going to move on to our final set of initial remarks from Vilas Dar. Vilas is the president of the Patrick J. McGovern Foundation, and he is also an entrepreneur and a technologist and a leading voice on equity in a tech-enabled world. So please, let's hear your comments, Vilas.
Thank you, Crystal, and thank you. I think the critical moment and the urgency is something we should come back to, but I want to take a second to acknowledge just how special the last 3 days have been and what a privilege and a joy it's been I'm a computer scientist turned human rights lawyer turned civil society activist. The conversations we've had, starting with products and platforms, going to algorithmic design, talking about data privacy and sovereignty, all undergirded with a fundamental conviction to the dignity and sovereignty of those who protect the people on the planet. It's really been a joy, and I want to thank you for that. One of the common threads that I've seen is the incredible capacity of this community to tell stories. So if you'll indulge me, I'll tell one very quick one. Unlike the many cool cats that I've seen in this room, I was a bit of a nerdy child. I love to read all the time. And I grew up in an immigrant family in a rural community in the US. And we didn't even really know that there were public libraries until I was a little bit further into my childhood. But I loved to read. And knowing that my parents couldn't afford to buy books, the library became the place. And I got to do a monthly field trip. I get to go to the library and get to get as many books as I wanted, and it's what I'd spend my entire month doing. And that was a great start. But something profoundly changed in my experience when the library came up with a new innovation. They came up with something called a bookmobile. And for those who aren't familiar, it's essentially a motorhome or an RV that gets equipped to have bookshelves, and they drive it out to communities. And all of a sudden, my way of engaging with information changed totally. Instead of going to the library once a month and bringing home a stack as big as I was, I could go and sit inside of this RV with air conditioning, a great luxury in the summertime. I could read to my heart's content. That was something quite special. And then something happened that even more profoundly changed my ability to access the information about the world, which is as I built relationships with those who would drive the bookmobile, it moved from a world where I read whatever they brought me. And I promise you, I read everything from detective novels to romance novels that were probably a little above my age range to nonfiction, whatever they gave me. But eventually I got to move to the place where I started to be able to request what I wanted. And they'd stock the shelves for me at the Central Library. I'd say, hey, I really want to learn about science topics, and they'd bring me entire shelves of it. I could sit there and engage. It's a very personal story, and I thank you for listening to it, but I'll tell you why I shared it. It feels like in the space that we're in, we started from that same place. What data do we have? What do we know about the world? How do we aggregate it and put it in a place where people can come and figure out what they need to do? That's where we've been for a while, building data repositories and platforms across the planet. And something has really shifted, and I see it in the conversations we've had over the past few days. We've moved from how do we shove data into a platform where people can access it, to how do we build the mechanisms and tools that bring that data from the library to the communities where people are. Some of the incredible things I've seen from open source tools that let people really come engage not just with the products of data analysis, but reshape that analysis itself, something that was a common thread through the sessions I saw. And then I think about the opportunity that exists in this moment to move us from not merely stepping into communities to offer tools, but to begin to listen to what communities are asking for, and to create real structured and tactical mechanisms by which community voice goes from something that we say is a principle of design to a truly practical and tactical way in which we engage. And there too, I've seen glimmers of that work across so many projects presented by the people in this room, and that's what gives me hope and inspiration in the moment. So thank you for that.
Thank you. Okay. Quick round of applause. I heard it coming, so might as well go for it. I'm going to dig into some questions now, but Slido is also up on the screen, so you can start inputting your questions as well. So I first want to dig into this question of this gap that we need to bridge, because I think every single one of you brought it up. Christian mentioned going to be in communities where none of the data and technology we're talking about today is present or even in people's awareness. We heard about the need for science telling, the need for bookmobiles, a translation emergency, and this need for radical inclusivity. So these are all nice phrases and terms to help us understand the challenge, but can any of you point to examples of where you see this gap starting to be bridged, or ideas about what a practical next step this community can take to bridge it? And I could call on someone, but if someone wants to jump in. Louise, I thought maybe you could give us a more practical example of science telling and what that looks like and how this community could start to practice it.
I mean, absolutely. What you've just done was fantastic science telling. What a delight to hear your story. And to find practical examples of really complex ideas and synthesize it down in a way that we can all tell. Something I like to say is that science telling can sometimes be in the form of the crazy stories of our grandmothers, oftentimes in communities like mine in the Philippines were very small, but they often operate outside of science. They often talk in stories. They would tell me about whistling for wind or planting rocks under types of soil, or even how best to kind of identify moon cycles to find the best time to plant. And that was kind of the environment that I grew up in. And then I was taken out of that environment and put in like a more rigid, where you have data, you have all this information and the more technical points. But I realized all of these are just the same ways of communicating the same messages and stories. The difference is my grandma got it from her grandma and their grandparents, and it was just generations of peer review and storytelling, of people observing things, versus a scientist who is able to put this in a journal and put it in technical words and numbers and forms that make sense. So really just bridging that gap and finding a way that's relatable to everyone. It could be through environmental psychology. It could be through communicating a little bit better, or having scientists go through a little bit more of a marketing campaign of understanding how design goes into these things. But also I think it's important that we have conversations about how we're having conversations. We're here together, and what's great is that, you know, data mapping in science and food and agriculture and forestation is kind of the baseline. But how do you communicate that to people who perhaps may not come from this background? The best way, I usually, as a Gen Zer, I would synthesize everything on an Instagram story so that other young people like me could get access to that. But maybe in your community, it's different. So I think something that we can all puzzle over is when you finally come home, how do you translate this to your language? When you're finally sat down on a couch jet-lagged, how do you tell this to your family over dinner? How do you tell this to your son or your daughter? And how do you explain the value in it and its potential in different parts of the world where you're finally going to go back to?
Thank you, that's really powerful. And actually, it really resonates with the experience we've had at Global Forest Watch when the community asks us, how are people using your data? What's been the impact of your data? And it's very tempting to point to website metrics or some indicator in our results framework for our donor. But the most compelling way to explain the impact of GFW is by telling the stories of our users. And we've gotten a lot more disciplined about how we collect those stories and how we learn from those stories, which is often a lot more nuanced and qualitative than any sort of quantitative metric for tracking our project. Does anyone else want to jump in on this?
Yeah.
Yeah, Andrew.
Yeah, I could steal with pride a framework that the Linux Foundation put forward of data is the fuel, applications are the vehicles or the cars, and the infrastructure is the roads. And then, of course, the user is the driver in this story. I think one of the tensions that our community faces is that we need local action. So we need people driving around locally. We need the fuel to be coming from wherever it powers the car. So it shouldn't really matter if the data comes from Madrid, Johannesburg, Manaus, wherever, so long as it's locally accurate. The infrastructure does truly need to be global, and it needs to be interoperable. But this application space, if you ever talk to people in technology, the first thing they talk about usually, if not the first, eventually it comes up, is customer empathy. And that's essential for building good applications. So my provocation to the room and to our community would be, who's going to have that customer empathy? Is it going to be the developers in Silicon Valley and the tech corridor in Germany, or is it going to be the developer community in Buenos Aires or the developer community in Jakarta? And so our biggest challenge is how do we produce the fuel, build the infrastructure, but then build all the different kinds of cars we need? And do it in a way that really enables those drivers to get where they need to be. So sorry if that was like too metaphorical, but
No, it's
I
a very
just found it
helpful
super
metaphor.
resonant.
I've heard it a couple times now. It's new to me, but it's helped me think of like the different areas we need to invest in to make sure that there's access for all.
I'd love to just jump in
Please.
and build on both of these points. And Louise, I thought your point was so important. One of the things I think has happened is we have often built tools for analysis, and that's felt really important. The transition from tools for analysis to tools for decision making is something that requires more than a technological mindset. Nick Kane on my team, who leads our climate work, tells a story of a partner who shares their experience going out and talking to and working with 150 local politicians on climate and policy action. And then the experience they've had of dealing with funders who say, what I want you to build is a tool that does X, Y, or Z. And their response, which I feel is so critical, in 150 plus conversations with the people who are making decisions, not one of them asked for this tool. So why would we build it just because a donor asked for it or because it felt like a useful thing to build? Rather than going and asking those people, what is it that you need in order to effectuate local policy? It requires a translation from data and quantitative truth to recognizing that decisions are made in a complex stochastic environment. And we need to look to decision makers in communities, at political levels, to tell us what supports them in making better decisions. That could be a centering path for us as we go forward.
Can I build on that? Because I agree with you completely. And it is not just having the data or the analysis like the Global Forest Watch. But when you sit down with the Minister of Environment or Forestry of a country, they're trying to make a decision into the future. I think that's where the issue of scenarios, options. It's not our job to give them the answer, but we can give them the tools and the issues that here are multiple scenarios. And you can make, if you do this, you can have this. And not just with the Ministry of Environment, but economics and issues. Those are the trade-offs that you're building. And it's taking what we have right now and projecting it into the future and empowering those people, whether it's the local community in Namibia, Conservancy, or it's the minister, or it's the Secretary of the UN. We need those scenarios, and that's sort of what IPCC does globally. What's that local version, and how do we use these tools and this data to empower that and to create those options? Because that is where decisions are being made.
One question I have is who does this translation? I'll jump right to you because
Yes.
this was your point. Yeah.
Can we consider the data, the existing data, as a foreign language to decision makers and try to see how to translate that into what they use on a daily basis? What they use on a daily basis is trying to understand where we are going, what is the vision that they have, and how what they have today as a situation, as a reality, is likely to bring them where they want to go or not. If it's not likely to bring them there, what should they do to get there? And we should not expect them to process the data. Well, it's not an assumption, it's the reality. None of the government where I come from has the capacity to produce that data and has the capacity to process that data. But if it's processed, they will very clearly understand that what we saw on the first day is not likely to bring them where they want to be. And then we can come out with options, as you said, with alternatives, involving many more public administrations at different levels, different sectors and different levels, also involving the communities. And if we are able to bring on board at that time people who are not in the forest sector, as I was saying, they will, on the grounds of the translated data, they will be able to change the way they operate in some of those communities, to change the priorities, but also their approaches.
So it's very clear. Decision makers don't need data, they don't need analysis, they need scenarios, options, visions for the future, stories. Someone needs to do that translation, and it's not entirely clear to me yet is who does that translation. And is it us? Is it someone else? If it is someone else, what are the capacities, skills, tools they need to do that translation effectively and in the context of the decision maker they're trying to support?
So I think part of what we need is what in the literature sometimes are called boundary institutions. So Alicia, how do you take institutions that bridge that gap precisely? And some of the think tanks do this. I mean, actually, I would argue WRI is one of them, very clearly, in the kind of work you do, because you're linking with the decisions and translating and building this community. When we set up the Humboldt Institute in Colombia, it was interesting. So we had the new environmental system, the ministry, and I was the chief science advisor for this. Part of my job was not just taking the data, but translating the question back to the scientific community. And we created an ecosystem of the data providers and the data analyzers, and we had decision making, and it was that. Another good example is Conavio in Mexico. And interestingly, I think those may be the best examples. The question I was answering this morning is, how do we create 100 of these? Because we need these institutions in other countries providing the right information in the right way, at the right time and speed to the right person. And how do we deliver that? And I think it's by building that capacity at the right level.
Absolutely, and this is something we've experienced firsthand. When we launched Global Forest Watch, all of a sudden there was this surge of interest and demand of people saying, I have this problem I'm trying to solve. I have a feeling this data might have something to do with the solution, but I don't really know. Can you help me? And we just couldn't serve them all. And we've seen more organizations sprout up who are providing that translation service, but we need more of it. We need to be investing in it as a community, maybe before we invest in even more data. But I promised I would take some audience questions, and I wanted to get to this point about collaboration and partnership, because I said it was the most important lesson. And Christian pointed to the need for different kinds of collaborations, partners, unusual ones. And one of the questions that came in is, how do you move from competition to co-production and collaboration when so many people have similar goals but different data, different techniques, different perspectives? So acknowledging that maybe there are some barriers to the collaborations we need to see. Do any of you want to reflect on that question?
Yeah, I'll offer two thoughts on this. The first is I want to acknowledge that the community in this room, as robust as it is still quite small when we look at the size and magnitude of the challenge we're trying to address, right? That by no means is this a space where we are competing for time, resources, or energy, except because of the incentive structures that are put around us. So it means for me that there are a couple of interventions that are absolutely necessary. The first is to change what the incentives are for collaboration. I think the pandemic certainly showed us exactly what happens when we drop into those deep rabbit holes and silos. To recognize that many of the solutions we've seen today, built independently and robustly, often address similar challenges, and that there's plenty to be done by sharing code bases, certainly, but maybe much more importantly, the human-learned wisdom of how we build these solutions. And the second intervention I'll say, and Christian, it goes back to your point, but maybe through a slightly different lens, I believe deeply in the power of transformative technology when it's cited at the front line of vulnerability. What that means is you can't do development so far away from where transformative impact happens that there's even a possibility to build this kind of siloing function. I know in this audience I'm sort of preaching to the choir a little bit, but as I think about the broader set of technologists who are trying to build particularly data and AI-driven technologies, that distance is getting bigger and bigger. And so what I think is possible is for us to take some agency in the moment to own the idea that when we build a solution, not only is it built according to the specifications and needs of our community members, as we've talked about, but it's built incorporating them into the development process in a way that's also a transfer of technical knowledge. That says, let's let the repositories and ownership of technology not sit with organizations that serve communities, but rather let it sit with the communities first, and let's figure out how to support those realized visions over time.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to jump in on this question of collaborations and partnership and how we drive what we need? Or an example of a collaboration or partnership that you see is very successful that we ought to be replicating?
I think the best thing for me is food systems. Oftentimes, you have the scientific community, you have data, you have all these geospatial mapping technology, but it has intersections in the most bizarre places. Just before I went up on stage, you were telling me how forestry has a link to guitars. And even in food systems, you know, when you cook, it's one thing to cook, it's one thing to farm something, it's another thing to design packaging for it. There's all sorts of different intersections. I think it's all complementary. It's really important to have this kind of multi-stakeholder engagement beyond the scientific community, beyond academia, into, say, the arts, into, say, maybe grassroots initiatives, even foundations. All these different aspects all kind of fall together. And the way we use it is really important, and who you give that data to. It serves different functions, as we've seen. So I think that's just incredibly vital to bring up. But also, there's no kind of industry or person who is outside of this data. It reflects us all. It's all interconnected, and it's all much closer than we think it is. And it can happen in the most bizarre industries or from people with the most remote backgrounds. It's just really finding a way to find where that link is and how to tie it to identify that niche.
Thank you, Louise. Christian.
So the question of collaboration, and I alluded to this, we have to bring a much broader set of stakeholders to these unusual collaborations. Because the challenges and the opportunities that we have are very, very broad. And they are going to require a systems change. And actually, one of the projects that we're doing is something called the Systems Change Lab. And specifically, so we want, in our case, we want to solve the climate and nature crisis. How are you going to do it? You have to look at it much more holistically. And there are people who are really good at the energy issue. People are really good at this. There are sort of slices of this thing. But unless you look at the group of them and how they intersect with each other, it's key. And each one of those requires these boundary institutions to slightly different communities to really bring them in. And I think our job is partly building that capacity in the ecosystem. Certainly is one of the major donors in this space now. So we need to build the pieces, but part of our job is bringing them together to really deal with this. And we're privileged working with a collaboration of other donors and saying, we're not going to pick you or you. We're actually willing to fund the community to work together to results that are not project-based, but they're outcome-based, and they're really joint collaborative projects. And I think that's something we can do to try and promote that.
Thank you. Go ahead, Andrew.
Yeah, I think there has to be space for good collaboration, and that has to be facilitated. But I'll speak with the voice of somebody who's been, I've lost track of how many times I've been pitched data and been pitched data to buy. So I think it's also important that we be clear, like which spaces are genuinely competitive. And you have businesses competing with research institutions, competing with nonprofits. And ultimately, having received more pitches than I can keep track of, the one unifying piece, one was that all their slide decks were beautiful and had lots of maps in them. But the one unifying piece is there was no objective ability to tell whose was good or not. And that makes this whole information economy grind to a complete halt. Because our factories would shut down tomorrow if we didn't have a specification for the ingredients we had to buy. And so I think it's important that we be very clear about where there is genuine competition and where there are genuine opportunities for collaboration. Obviously, the two interface, but how do we create those conditions for good collaboration, but also good competition?
Yeah, I think it's important to remember that competition is also good and healthy in the space, because a lot of what we're trying to do is experimental. It's never been done before, and we don't know what's going to succeed, who is going to succeed. But at the same time, there comes to a point of redundancy, and there comes to a point where we need to start aligning to make it clear for the end users what products can move forward. We're running short on time, so I want to ask one maybe slightly provocative question that has come from the audience. So we've had a lot of conversation about trying to bridge the gap, move more data to communities, empower communities to be able to generate their own data and to make these translations, et cetera. So given all that, what is the role for top-down approaches for monitoring global landscapes and creating global maps, given this call and need for more bottom-up approaches? Is there still a role or not?
Yes, I'll start.
Yes, please.
No, I think there is, but we have to bridge it. So actually this morning we had a very interesting session. So for example, one of the big initiatives that we're supporting right now is, again, around 30 by 30. We're taking, to say, tropical Andes. How do we help these countries get to do 30% of protected areas in the right places, based on science with right management? So I saw a very interesting demo today about how we use Global Forest Watch and take that specifically, but down to the country and to the local area. And we're looking at a polygon and saying, how is this place doing, and how do we provide that tool and that data at that scale of analysis to the right people? And we just had a workshop a few weeks ago in Ecuador with the Ministry of Environment. So let's sit down and do this. So I think those kinds of tools, I mean, what Planet is doing right now is amazing, but let's do it through platforms like Global Forest Watch, but put them there to help answer these questions by the right people. And the good news is you can take it all the way down to the community level. And by the way, you can also, I think the thing that's missing is how do we collect and build the tools so that that community observation knowledge can input into this? Because it is not just the scientific top-down data, it's the bottom-up. It's a two-way stream. And I think we've got really interesting examples and opportunities in that space.
And there's also an important distinction between global data and global platforms.
Yeah.
They're interrelated, and we use a global platform like GFW to take that global data and help make it more relevant in a local context. Does anyone else want to chime in on this? Yes, please,
Yes,
Samuel.
I think the global data provide clear information on deforestation hotspots, and they point out places where action is needed with emergency. And then it's possible for local NGOs, local government, private sector to focus on those areas, generate more information, and design what will be the best action possible for such an area. And I think what also will be missing will be to share that back to the global platform so that it becomes an inspiration for other people facing the same type of challenges.
Absolutely. Louise.
Yeah, building up on that, it's really important to know that oftentimes these kinds of data and information come from Western spaces or global North spaces and don't entirely reflect the experiences and the lived kind of reality of people in global South. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't, sometimes it does to an extent because the science that we know is in a structure that has predominantly come from a very global North history. So it's really important to break down that barrier and really looking into the social cultural context and allowing that to feed it back into the global data that we see. And I think that's really important in science telling and in different areas because we need to break down those barriers that limit us to these specific industries and go on to different platforms like, say, the lead up to dialogues in COP28 or even more in like biodiversity talks. But beyond that, in talks that are niche to, say, food and culinary, or even in opening that up to a broader audience and being able to make sure that that global data is available to just the general population of people and have say university students, even younger people, make this data trendy enough that it accelerates work being done in it to turn the lever on forestation.
Thank you. And Andrew, I think you wanted to go next.
Sure. On the global top-down piece, I think there's two spots. One is scalable and scalable and reusable infrastructure being one, and then the other is I think there could be a really important role for global top-down guidance on approaches for standards of care and appropriate use of locally collected ground truth. I think that could be a really powerful catalyst.
Absolutely. So not just thinking about global data, but global infrastructure, things that can be customized and applied to create data at different levels as well. I'm going to ask you all to give a round of applause for our panelists because I think we're out of time for this segment. Thank you so much. And you can return to your seats. Thank you. Go ahead. And I have one last act for us to drive us home. I'm going to invite two people on the stage. They are both people that I have known for a while, and they're the type of people that I sit down with a cup of coffee and end up in a 3-hour engrossing conversation. And these people didn't know each other until recently, so naturally I thought I should introduce them and ask them to have a conversation on stage in front of hundreds of people. So let me welcome Evan Tahosky from WRI's Data Lab. WRI's Data Lab is the technology team that is behind many of WRI's geospatial data platforms like Global Forest Watch. And then also Tasso Azevedo, whom I think you all probably know because I think he's spoken in at least 5 or 6 sessions at this summit. But he is, of course, the founder and leader of Map Biomas, which is a collaborative network of organizations across Brazil and now Latin America and now the world who are driving innovation in land cover and land use monitoring. So I'm hoping that you all, it's a big ask, but I'm hoping you all can drive us home. And you heard a lot of calls to action from this panel just now. What are some ways we can now start to move forward as a community?
And you can stay in the conversation.
I'm going to head back down to my seat. You know where to find me.
So we will stand up here because then the brain circulates better, the oxygenation. And
Not enough coffee for the long day, but thank you so much, Crystal, for welcoming us, and thank you, Tasso, for joining. You need no introduction. This group has spoken to you, seen you this week, the incredible work that you do through Map Biomas and everything you bring together. So excited to just share this, and let's bring it home. So my first question is, you're a veteran of these stages. You're a veteran of these events. What's different? What's different from the last time we had the GFW Summit, from every other event that you've gone to before? Is there something that is compelling and actually different about the week we've just had together?
yeah, I think at the first time, maybe when we had the Global Forest Watch, before the summit, we have another event, right, before that. I think that the distinction is that was, until now, that was like the Global Forest Watch, so it's more or less like the forest. And then we were talking about forests, sometimes we talk about carbon, and we stay there in this agenda. And I think this was an opportunity to kind of broadening a lot the discussion. We actually had a panel which was like beyond carbon, And I think it's more than beyond carbon. We are talking beyond carbon. I think now we are talking beyond forests, including the other biomes, and not just like it's not just forest or woodland. We can talk about grasslands. We can talk about the water. We can talk about the other subjects. And also importantly, we are also talking about the land use itself, like how we, by managing the different, farming activities and etc., we are interfering not just on climate, but in biodiversity, in conservation, in the well-being and the development. So I think that was a very different scene from what we had before, and I think it's. I think I was mentioning that it's like I'm glad that this is not happening on a COP, because in the last 10 years, everything we invent new, then in this space we said, oh, let's make an event on COP and the next climate COP, and I'm glad that this is not happening. That we have something, a new space, a moment that we can, have us together without the distractions of a COP. To have at this moment I think was pretty cool.
That's incredible, and I think speaks to the focus on system change and all these sort of different systems coming together to talk about it. At the same time, that can be pretty intimidating. If you're a scientist, spend your whole year working on forests, working on deep in these systems, and you say you have to have a conversation with someone in the public health ministry. You have to have a conversation with someone in the planning ministry. That can be intimidating. What do we need to do to enable ourselves, those of us in this room who care about these topics, to be able to do that work, to work across these systems, to make data products that are actually useful and can be translated for these different use cases?
Yeah, I think there was something that I'm glad that Krista, when she made the first presentation, she had these 3 messages. I don't know if everybody remember all of them, but the last 2, which I think it was very good on the beginning to set the stage, was this idea that when we do mapping and when we do those products, there is always some kind of a question or a direction or a need or a purpose or a motive that it's driving you. And so it's normally when we do this in science, we try to say that we are totally kind of agnostic of the motive and how this will be used. But at the end, it means a lot. Like how you invest your energy on something that can be used for the most practical way. So one of the things that I think it's also growing, we're still far away from where we need, is this idea that we get closer to the need before we start. And I think this has a lot to do with this idea that we have to reinforce the bottom-up process. So it's very important to create those like global products, global maps and visions, because it actually open our eyes for the many ways in which you can use this technology, that you can make things possible in scale. But at the same time, we have to guarantee a process in which we can make this possible to be executed, developed by anyone, virtually any place in the world, so we can get closer to the needs. And the need sometimes is just to translate things in a way that can be used by, used locally. We have thousands of stories on that. Like when we create Mapiomas, we had one very specific purpose, right? We want to have a better calculation of greenhouse gas emissions. So we want to have maps of land use, so you can compare every year. You have the map, compare one year for the other, you know the change, and then you can estimate the emissions. That's probably the least use of Mapiomas today. And people are inventing just other things. So as we talk with the people, they're creating other demands and products. And ideally, what we want is to have people everywhere able to respond to those demands. And so that's what I mean by having, like, you have the global initiatives, the large-scale initiatives that help us to create the vision and the ideas and the insights to actually be able to, at local level, just respond to specific needs. One interesting one was we started this product in water, like just mapping water, and it's very difficult to map water annually because water is moving, right? This thing moves. So we said, oh, we have to have monthly maps. And then we produced these monthly maps and produce the water. And then, but the water agency was saying to us, actually what is important for us is to know whether this is an artificial water body or a natural water body. Because in certain regions you will see the water surface growing, but that's not what is matter. What matters for them is to know how much is growing because we are building up new dams, and what's happening with the natural water streams. And so this creates another demand for us. It's like, oh, how can we sort out our way to separate those things? Same thing happened with mining. Like the importance to differentiate between industrial mining and gold mining. And this was not in our head because our demand was another one. So I think it's really important to have this, balance this thing of thinking globally, but then have a way in which we are able to actually do this at local level.
Absolutely. So after this week, what still stands in our way to make that work, to make that two-way street work between the global benefits that we have, the global community we have, the local benefits, the local actors, and the local needs? What remains as blockers and barriers?
Well, I would say one thing for me, which actually, including changed the mission of Mapiomas. Like our original mission was to, create those maps so people can have better decisions, and help this to be expanded to other geographies. And now we realize that actually the mission should be to guarantee that in any tropical country, for example, we have people able to produce those maps. So the maps is just the result, but the importance to have that. So I think this notion that we have to spend the time necessary and the resource necessary to guarantee that you have this capacity is something that is that's very important to happen. Not just like to validate data or to create samples and stuff like this, to do the whole thing, like to code and program, etc. So that's one. Second thing is, I think we are living now for a revolution of what type of sensors and data will be available. Like we saw this week, like this, satellites that can measure methane directly, and we work with 4, 5, 7 bands, and then people are talking about 300 bands in one satellite, and you can kind of see, I don't know, you'll be able to see the soul of the people, I don't know, something like this. Okay. So it's kind of really scary. But I think the big revolution that we had actually on remote sensing was not based on this, was based on Landsat, MODIS, and Sentinel, for one reason. It's treated as a public good. It's available to anyone. You can make a revolution because it's available to anyone. So I do understand that most of those new sensors and etc., they are coming from private investments. They have to have a business model to allow for this to happen. But I think it's a challenge for us. I think maybe next year when we come back, we have to find a way to have, how can we transform those things also in public goods? Find a business model, a way in which we can make those new sensors and technologies to be treated as a public good, at least for the purpose that we are talking here. So I think one way to do that is, I think Norway show one way to do it, like with the Norway program on satellites. I remember that the first time we discussed about that or talk about that, they were thinking whether they will create their own satellites. Like, maybe we just create our own satellites, we make our own system, and then I think what's brilliant that they decide not to do it, but to do something that, have some of the image available in different formats. But it's still far from what is needed, because we have some parts of what is available there in a certain format. And the interesting thing was to be, how can we transform all of that available to anyone to take the most of these technologies?
That's great. Well, you're here, so what's still missing? Well, what are those pieces of infrastructure, like the NICFI data program, those kind of big blocks that, if brought to the market as public goods, would transform how you work, how Biomas works, and how other works around the world?
Yeah, I think there are some things about infrastructure also, but it's like, again, it's kind of more like a resolution of how this will be available. So for example, the things that you can really take out a lot of information and make a lot of things. Other things that are in infrastructure, like Google Earth Engine and others. I think AWS also is doing something on this. Others, which are places where you have the image, and you have the processing capacity to do it, and you have easy ways to learn, which is kind of important as a way of accessing. So I think the elements are there. The question is how we make this to scale up in terms of capacity and so on. Now, I was thinking about what could be some like bold things that could happen on suddenly on the next years. One of the things that keeps in mind, like when I started this business, I didn't know anything about satellite. When I started Mapium, I just had some questions, and I have no idea how satellite works. For me, it was like magic. You have an image, bands, and stuff like this. So my idea was that we will go, that was how I think this thing works. Like I will go somewhere, I give some samples, say this is a forest, this is a farm, and etc. And then you give to the computer, and the computer will give you back everything else, which is a forest or something like this, right? And apparently it was not like that the thing works and get some more time. But now I realize that for the things that are here this week here, and with all this revolution on AI and stuff, that maybe in the next corner somewhere, in some, like maybe in 2-3 years, we come back here, and that's the reality. Like anyone, any citizen, don't need to be a specialist on anything, could just go there and give some samples of the things that you are interested, and this suddenly can come back. So I think if, as a community, we can think about that, like how can we make this thing so easy that the public, the decision makers, don't need us, actually. They can just go and look for what they want. So I think this is the type of the big jump that it will be like, like in orders of magnitude in facilitation for everyone to use. Like you don't need to be a specialist on anything. You just go there, make the question, get the answer.
Yeah.
Like GTP something.
Sure. We can retire and do woodworking, right? Or something fun like that. So one of the things Crystal raised in her opening remarks, the third one, partnership. I know that you and Matt Baumas participate in, lead, or on all sides of various partnership, and it's, of course, a watchword in our community, but it hides a lot of different experiences. Some partnerships are extremely extractive. They feel horrible for people involved. Some are amazing and transformative. And so I was wondering if you could reflect a little bit on what partnership has meant to you in this community, and what are some of principles or just things you've learned about being a good partner and having others be good partners with you?
Yeah. Let put it this way. I think when we build networks and coalitions to solve things, if you are building that partnership from the principle that you know what has to be done, you know all the pieces that has to be realized, and then you want to find people to do specific parts to solve the problem, that's where we create this kind of perception that you were not fully embedded in this one. I think the most durable and reliable and important partnerships, the ones that motivate people to be, is when you actually bring people together to together think about the solution of a challenge. So like something that alone no one could actually solve, but by being together and try to find out where we can be complementary. We don't know exactly what each one will do, but together we will figure out and then move. That's kind of the way I think the bonds and the partnership are the strongest one. So you're not in your silo inside a group doing something. You are actually part of something that is kind of embedded somehow, and then you find out that's something that you can contribute to the group. But you don't feel that you are just a part there doing a specific. So we see this in Mapiomas a lot. Like we have this 70 organizations involved. I would say that about 40 of those organizations are really embedded So it's like they can be playing multiple roles. Some of them are more outside, just playing some specific roles. But we try to have everybody as just one organ, like one coalition, where if you want to be more involved, you have the space to do so, because you're not seen as, you know, you are the specialist on just specific these things. I know, just kind of a more organic thing.
Sure, absolutely. Maybe jumping back up Crystal's list to motive. We heard so many motives this week, and of course on this stage today, we've heard about these powerful motives to help local actors actually act, to make decisions, to drive toward change. But we also know there's a lot of global motives. And in fact, with the advent of EUDR and many other sort of climate finance developments, there's money flowing to this space. There are global motives for companies, for large actors, et cetera. At the same time, we hear and know and care deeply about these local motives. And then there's also national motives. Like countries themselves have a focus here. For all of us who are in this space, doing research, building products, trying to connect these dots, how do we think about these different motives? Are there sort of win-wins we should be thinking about, or are there going to be trade-offs? Are there going to be things where we have to align ourselves with one motive or another over the next few years?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we have to be open to understand what are the most pressing issues. I will come back to one of the discussions we have here, like this. We learn here that, I mean, it's so obvious that what we call protect forest people or indigenous people, you know, all types of forest people, they are the best stewardship for the forest. And so the most important motive at this moment is secure the land tenure, right? So what are the things that we can do in all sorts of levels on each region? What is the specific thing that is more important to do? Maybe in Brazil, as we were discussing, like maybe it's just like help to have like 20, 30 people helping to do all the studies that are important in Brazil. Maybe it's just producing the maps in this situation. So I think going from the global, which is like the need of maintaining all the forests and at the same time the well-being of this people, then combined with what is the specific need that you have in each place. But again, I think the best investment that we do is to guarantee that we have at most local level possible the capacity to think about a way to solve a problem and be able to execute. Not having to go through a process to find someone that will be able to execute this thing. And if I could say something like in a kind of a way of thinking about the funding and research, I think we, and this community is a good one to think about this, is how can we, let's say in 1 year, maybe when we come back next year here in Belgium, I don't know where it will be the summit, but there will be a summit next year, right? That's definitely, this is like, we love this, so we want to have this.
Just a little vacation, yeah. You know, maybe a year and a half or something like that.
Okay, but next time we come back, we could have something like, we can invent a mechanism that is much beyond carbon, or regardless the carbon debate and etc., a global mechanism in which we can, you know, pay or benefit the whoever is protecting, maintaining, restoring, not just forests, natural environments, and guarantee the rights of forest people. Like, could be something like just, we have to think smartly. We have enough information to think about something simple that can deliver this type of very clear, tangible return for those that are working for this protection.
Absolutely. A lot can be done in a year if we focus and set our minds to it. And Tasso, we're at time, so I want to thank you so much for your time here with us on the stage, for everyone else who joined us, and thank you again.
Thank you. Nice to meet you.
So there we are at the end of 3 amazing days. 3 amazing days, packed, really, really packed with content. And we've heard so much through all of these days, but I think, Tasso, one of the things that you said was, actually, there's nothing like being together in person. And I think that's also really what I felt. When I was walking through the corridors, I saw a group groups of people everywhere, chatting, and even during the coffee breaks and at the receptions. You were all there, all at it. I think work really never stopped. And it's that magic of coming together in person that also creates this. There were about nearly 650 people here in the room. We did about 50 sessions. There were over 200 speakers. People from 50 countries participated in this session. I think that truly shows what a global community this is and how important it is to bring all of those pieces together from worldwide. And where, of course, it's completely impossible to do any kind of a wrap-up of this, let me just share some of my personal takeaways, especially from the last session, which again, like everything else that I followed, was just so rich. Collective action is needed to build a revolution, a data economy for forest and nature. Radical transparency should lead to radical equity. We need to talk about the opportunities in a language that farmers and politicians will understand to be about their land, their food, their neighbors. And think tanks and science institutes can play an important role. Because sometimes, for politicians, science is a bit like a foreign language. I'll tell you a little secret. I used to be a politician. And I can certainly say that it helps a lot to know that the data with which you are presented is absolutely rigorous. So your work, the work of so many rigorous scientists, really is the basis for any impact that this information and this data can have. And finding ways to discuss with communities about what they would like. Pilar was, like you, a total bookworm. I read every book I could lay my hands on. But as the libraries grew bigger, of course, I needed the help of a librarian to help me navigate what I actually wanted. And to have that discussion with the local communities, showing them also the possibilities that data can present to them, I think that indeed may perhaps be what we could be doing. How the next stage was already set, a next common good, a data GPT, or whatever it should call. I think it kind of sets the stage for another meeting like this. Because, what do you think? Should we do this again? But of course, to do this again, you need a great team. You need a great team spirit. And you need a great team leader with amazing qualities. And you need amazing supporters. So I'd also really want to invite you to give a warm applause to the supporters of all of this, the teams from the Land and Carbon Lab, the MCI staff, Bezos Earth Fund, the WRI staff, NICFI, all of those and all the contributing partners that have made this a possibility. Let's please give them all a very warm round of applause. It would really not have been possible without you, but I want to thank one person, of course, very special. Crystal, you made this all happen. Thank you so much for guiding us through these amazing days. Thank you so much. And now I'm really going to send you home. It was a pleasure to welcome you here a couple of days ago. And I'd just like to remind you of two small housekeeping rules, which is please hand in your badge. Let's make sure that those flowers get planted somewhere, either in your garden or on this organic farm that we're going to donate these to. And also, please help us to make this kind of a conference even better, or just use the survey to give your personal compliments to the teams that have worked so hard to make this a reality. I wish you all a very safe journey home. Bye-bye.